How does the 5-year rule work with Roth IRA conversions? How is this rule different for conversions than it is for contributions? And what free app do airlines hope and pray you never hear about? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 109th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. So today's topic is a continuation of a topic we started in podcast 105, DoughRoller.net/podcast 105, about the 5-year rule as it applies to Roth IRAs. And as I dug into this rule, it became obvious pretty quickly how complicated this rule is. And in fact, as I mentioned in the first podcast 105, there are really two rules. One that applies to the earnings from contributions, and the other one, the one we're going to talk about today, that applies to conversions. And so I'm going to try to sort all this out as best I can. As I'm quick to say, I'm not a tax expert. This is something you absolutely want to get right. So unless you're positive, you know what you're doing, you're going to want to consult a tax specialist before you make any moves. But I will do my best to walk through my understanding of this rule as it relates to conversions. And it's like I said, it's a complicated topic. Going to hear from a listener first, a listener named Lawrence who sent in an email actually on this topic. He emailed me in response to the podcast 105. So I thought I'd include that in today's show. I'll read you his email in just a minute. We'll cover that first. And then at the end, the tip of the day is a free app that I think you'll be interested in if you've ever been bumped from a flight or delayed. I've got some questions about this app, but I saw it and I thought, well, man, I'll share it with you. Maybe some of you have already used it. Others of you might give it a try. I'd love to hear your reaction to it, but that'll come at the end of the show. So let's get started. First, the email from Lawrence. He writes in, he says, in your Roth IRA article, and again, he's referring to podcast 105, the 5-year Roth IRA rule, you have 4 examples of situations where age and first year of contributions play a part in determining taxes and penalties. In your 3rd and 4th example, you show the same outcome, even though the 5-year rule was met on the 3rd example and not on the 4th. Is this true, or should this example have said no tax and penalty for the 3rd example in your blog, but first one below, and I'll walk through them in just a second. It seems that the penalty arises when you are under 59.5, and the tax arises when the 5-year rule isn't met. All right, I know that's hard to follow because this whole rule is hard to follow. Here are the rules he's talking about. And again, this is the 5-year rule as it relates to earnings from contributions. So if you've not listened to podcast 105 and this is an important issue for you, you need to go listen to it. This applies to earnings from contributions. If you're under 59.5 and have met the 5-year rule, you pay tax and penalty. So effectively, the 5-year rule doesn't do any good for you, right? And if you're under 59.5 and you've not met the 5-year rule, you once again pay tax and penalty. That's absolutely correct. If you're under 59.5, and I should add, and I made this clear in the podcast 105, there are other ways for qualified distributions besides being 59.5, right? You could be totally disabled, for example. But we're just sort of focused on the 59.5 rule, which I think applies for most people. If you haven't met that rule, as it relates to earnings from contributions, the 5-year rule doesn't help you one way or another. You're still going to pay tax and penalty, right? Where the 5-year rule comes into play as it relates to earnings from contributions is the situation where you are over 59.5 but have not met the 5-year rule. That's where it comes into play. Now, he goes on in his email. He says, also, with that in mind, why do you think they label the 5-year rule as a tax and the age requirement a penalty? It seems like not following this guideline would intuitively be called a penalty since the money is already after tax, or is this just another example of how the IRS has been difficult? Well, That's a good question. So here's the deal on this sort of 10% penalty and then versus just paying your ordinary tax on a distribution. Actually, the IRS doesn't refer to the 10% as a penalty. So if you look at topic 557 from the IRS, it's called additional tax on early distributions from traditional and Roth IRAs. And it says, to discourage the use of IRAs for purposes other than retirement, the law imposes a 10% additional tax on early distributions from traditional and Roth IRAs unless an exception applies, and then it goes on into more detail. But you notice they don't call it a penalty. They call it an additional tax. So where did the word penalty come from? Well, I think it was just developed as a way to distinguish between paying ordinary income tax on a distribution on the one hand and paying this 10% additional tax on the other. And so just as shorthand, it's kind of come to be known as a penalty. And in fact, just to make things easy or easier, that's how I'm going to refer to it in this podcast. So there'll be ordinary income tax potentially on a distribution versus the 10% penalty. Although technically, again, it is an additional tax. So there you go. Those are my best answers for Lawrence's email. I do appreciate those emails. So feel free to send them in, DoughRoller.net. Would love to hear from you. And now we're going to get on to the main topic, and that is this 5-year rule as it relates to Roth IRA conversions. So what we're going to do today is walk through sort of 9, elements of this 5-year rule. I've reduced the 5-year rule to 9 things. Some of them will be some examples, some ways to use this rule to your advantage. And some of them will just be the nuts and bolts of the rule and how it works. So let's get through this now. We're going to start with number 1, and this is a kind of a review, but here it is. The 5-year rule on conversions is used to determine whether you'll pay the 10% penalty on the amount you converted. All right. Now, I want to, just so we're all on the same page, let's compare that to podcast 105 and contributions. Remember, the 5-year rule on contributions applies to any earnings, right? Remember, it doesn't apply to the actual contributions because you can withdraw those tax and penalty free at any time. So the 5-year rule, as it applies to contributions, applies to any earnings from those contributions. The 5-year rule on conversions that we're talking about today applies to the actual amount you converted, the principal you converted. All right, that's the first difference. The second difference is the 5-year rule on contributions that applies to earnings is there to help you determine whether, if you withdraw those earnings, you'll pay income tax, ordinary income tax on those earnings. The 5-year rule that applies to the amount converted in a conversion is not to determine whether you'll pay any income tax on that principal or the amount converted, but rather whether you'll pay the 10% penalty. So 2 big differences in this, what seems at first to be a pretty simple rule. If you can count to 5, you should be able to figure out the 5-year rule. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Again, on the contributions, it applies to earnings. For the conversion, it applies to the amount converted. On contributions, it's there to determine whether withdrawal of the earnings is taxable. For conversions, it's there to determine whether the withdrawal of the amount converted is subject to a 10% penalty. Now, as confusing as all of that is, and all I can say is please don't shoot the messenger. I didn't write these rules. Understanding the purpose of the 5-year rule as it applies to conversions, I think may help. So so let's move to that. This is point number 2. The purpose of the 5-year rule as it applies to Roth IRA conversions is to prevent people from avoiding the 10% penalty for early withdrawals on traditional IRAs. So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine someone is 40. They want to withdraw $100,000 from a traditional IRA. They know they're going to have to pay the ordinary income tax, the tax on it, but they'd like to avoid the penalty. So they get this bright idea. I know what I'll do. I'll convert my traditional IRA to a Roth. I'll pay the taxes. I have to pay those anyway. But then once it's converted to a Roth, then the next day I'll go ahead and withdraw it all and avoid the 10% penalty. Well, the IRS was a little too smart for that, and they said, no, you can't do that. So to keep people from doing that, what they said is you've got to wait 5 years, and only by waiting 5 years can you avoid this 10% penalty. Now, that's assuming you're under 59 and a half, right? Once you're over 59 and a half, it's a different situation. We'll actually talk about that more. But in the example I gave, you're 40, you want to try to avoid the 10% penalty. the IRS says, no, not going to be that simple. You can't just convert to a Roth and then take your money out and avoid the penalty. We're going to impose this 5-year, you can almost think of it as a waiting period, this 5-year waiting period that you're going to have to sit through before you can avoid the 10% penalty. So understanding that purpose of the rule, I think, helps kind of frame all of the issues. So now let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. When does the 5-year clock start to tick? And the answer is it starts as of January 1 of the year in which you convert to the Roth IRA. Now remember, the 5-year rule on contributions, remember you can contribute to an IRA up until your taxes are due the following year. So if you were to contribute, say, on April 15th of a year for the previous tax year, the 5-year period would start to run as of January 1 of the previous year. Conversions don't work that way. When you convert to a Roth IRA, the conversion is as of whatever day you've converted. And for purposes of the 5-year rule, what the IRS says is we'll start the clock running from January 1 of that year. So we're in September of 2014. If you were to convert today, the 5-year clock on that conversion would begin to run as of January 1, 2014. Okay. Point 4. The 5-year rule applies separately to each and every conversion. If you've listened to Podcast 105, you know that for the 5-year rule as it applies to contributions, once you've satisfied it, once you've even put away $100 and contributed to a Roth IRA and started that clock, once the 5 years elapse, you're good to go. You've met that rule forever on all contributions. It doesn't work that way with conversions. You have to meet the 5-year rule separately for each and every conversion. And if we think back to the purpose of the rule as it relates to conversions, that makes sense because they're wanting to avoid folks trying to do an end around the 10% penalty by converting traditional IRAs into Roths and taking the money out right away. And they want to do that for all the conversions. So this is the 5-year rule. You have to meet it for each and every conversion. Again, very different than the 5-year rule as it applies to contributions. Are we having fun yet? Well, I hope you are. I know this is mind-numbing, but a very, very important distinction. Okay. Point number 5, we talked a bit about this in Podcast 105, but it deals with when you take a distribution from your Roth IRA, what comes out first, right? We talked about contributions come out first, then conversions, and then earnings, right? That's how the IRS treats the withdrawals, regardless of which Roth IRA. You may have multiple Roth IRAs. It doesn't matter which one you take it out of. That's how they allocate your withdrawals. Well, when it comes to conversions, and here's point 5, distribution of conversions is on a Fifo basis, so first in, first out. And this gets a little tricky, but stay with me. You're deemed to have converted pre-tax dollars that are distributed first, and then after-tax dollars. Let me explain what I mean. You can have a traditional IRA that has pre-tax dollars. That is, you've contributed dollars and you've contributed money and you've taken a tax deduction. Those would be pre-tax dollars, right? You can also contribute after-tax dollars. So in other words, you've already paid taxes on the money and then you've contributed to a traditional IRA. And both kinds of IRAs can be converted into a Roth. In fact, you may have an IRA that has a little bit of both in it, some pre-tax dollars and some after-tax dollars, and you might convert the whole thing. And when it comes to distributing that money, first contributions are going to come out, but then when it gets to conversions, they're going to first deem those dollars converted that you paid taxes on at the time of conversion. That's really the way to think about it. Those will come out next, and then any after-tax dollars you converted will come out after that, and then followed by earnings. Again, in the show notes, I'll have this listed out for you. I know it can be very difficult to follow, but that's very important to understand because, just because you've got all these 5-year rules and other requirements, but you may be able to take a distribution from a Roth IRA tax and penalty free, even if you haven't met all of these rules, if it's coming out of contributions you've made, for example, right? So understanding the tax implications of a distribution can get very difficult and a lot of different moving parts. And so the FIFO basis and the order of distribution is very, very important. And so that's how they do it with respect to conversions. They first assume you've distributed any pre-tax dollars or monies converted that triggered taxes and then monies converted that did not trigger taxes because they were after tax dollars. Now, with all of that complication, let's now get to point 6, and that's the rules. Let's just kind of walk through the scenario. So we're going to assume that you're under 59 and a half and that you don't meet any of those other requirements like being totally disabled and so forth. So we're going to assume you're under 59 and a half and you've not met the 5-year rule on a conversion. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, it depends if you're withdrawing money that was converted that triggered taxes because it was pre-tax dollars and you had to pay taxes on the conversion, or if you converted non-taxable money, like in a backdoor Roth scenario. So the first thing that's going to come out are converted monies that were taxable that triggered taxes on the conversion, right? So what's the answer? Well, will you pay ordinary income tax? No. Why? You've already paid it, right? You paid it when you converted the money. Will you pay a penalty? Yes, you will. The 10% penalty. Again, you're under 59 and a half, and the 5-year rule has not been met. Now, what about converting money from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA that was after tax? So when you converted it, you didn't have to pay any tax because you'd contributed after tax dollars. You'd already paid the tax, right? Well, here, of course, as you would expect, no ordinary income tax, right? But there's also no penalty. Does that surprise you? Why is that? Well, remember the purpose of this rule? It's to prevent people from taking advantage of the conversion and then withdrawing the money and avoiding the 10% penalty. But here we're talking about monies you converted that were after tax, right? You'd contributed them to a traditional IRA. It was after tax dollars. You got no deduction from it. Well, guess what? You can take that money out. So in other words, there was no penalty for you to try to avoid. So in that case, they don't impose a penalty now. All right, under 59 and a half, and the 5-year rule is met, right? What happens then? Well, for both types of conversions of both taxable and non-taxable, there's no penalty and there's no tax. You've met the 5-year rule, so there'd be no penalty, right? And this is amounts you've converted, and either at the time of conversion you paid the tax or they were after tax dollars to begin with. Either way, you'd already paid tax on them, so there's no tax. Again, I'll have all of this listed in the show notes. I can only imagine what it's like listening to this podcast with all of these different factors and criteria and numbers. Hope you're following it, but again, I'll have this laid out in the show notes. Now, if you're over 59 and a half, right, or you have one of those other exceptions like total disability, but again, we're focused on just the 59 and a half to make it a little easier. If you're over 59 and a half and you've met the 5-year rule, well, I mean, that's like the ideal situation, right? I mean, that's exactly what the Roths were intended for. So obviously no tax or no penalty. But listen, even if you haven't met the 5-year rule, but you're over 59 and a half, there's still no penalty or tax, right? Because yes, you have to, the 5-year rule is designed to determine whether or not you should pay a penalty on the distribution of the conversion. But there are other ways to avoid the penalty. And one of them is being 59 and a half or older. So the 5-year rule as it relates to conversions really relates to those who are under 59 and a half. And again, I'll lay this out in the show notes like I did in the previous podcast, and we're in podcast 109, so you'll find them at DoughRoller.net/podcast 109, right? So 3 kind of examples, and some of this is going to be a bit repetitive of what I've said, but just to kind of hopefully cement this a little bit. So the first one, this is point 7 overall. Remember, if you're over 59 and a half, even if you have not met the 5-year rule, right, there are other exceptions to the 10% penalty, one of them, of course, being older than 59 and a half. So we just covered that, but I want to make sure that's crystal clear, right? If you're under 59 and a half, right, well, we know you've got to wait that 5 years to avoid the 10% penalty, but there still is an advantage, right? I mean, you have to wait the 5 years, but if you're 40 and you convert a traditional IRA and you wait your 5 years, you avoid the 10% penalty. You wouldn't be able to do that if you'd kept the money in the traditional IRA. I suppose the downside is you have to pay your taxes 5 years earlier. So there's sort of pros and cons, but it is a way to get your money out of the IRA and avoid the 10% penalty. Again, you got to wait 5 years, which means you've got to pay the taxes on the conversion sooner than if you just left it in a traditional IRA, but that is an option for you. That's point 8, and it actually leads to the 9th and final point in all of this, and that is there are some strategies here for early retirees, folks that want to retire early, and they're looking for different sources for their retirement income. They've not hit 59 and a half. And so what a lot of folks do is sort of ladder their conversions. They will convert from a traditional IRA, maybe it'll come from a 401k to a traditional IRA and then convert over to a Roth. And they'll convert say 1 year of living expenses each year for a number of years. And why do they do it that way? Well, a couple of reasons. One is by converting a little bit less each year rather than doing it as, say, one lump sum, it lowers the taxes that they pay, keeps them from bumping up into higher tax brackets. So they will, rather than figuring out what they need for all of early retirement, they'll break it up and convert a portion of it each year to keep to minimize the tax hit. And then at the same time, for each conversion, it starts the 5 years running. So they may be planning to retire in 5 years. So that's when they start this process, and they convert some in year one, get the clock started. Then do the same thing in year two, and so on. And so there are some early retirement strategies sort of baked into this 5-year rule as it relates to conversions, and that can help you if that's part of your plan. I mean, there are of course a lot of other ways to tap retirement resources other than these sort of laddered conversion of traditional IRAs to Roth IRAs, but this is at least one tool that you can take advantage of. Now, all of this I know is confusing. I'll have the show notes that hopefully will help you. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, and above all, if you're at a point where you need to make some important decisions, I highly, highly encourage you to get some professional tax advice. Frankly, that's what I would do, and I spend my day studying this because I'd want to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. This stuff gets very confusing. The rules can change from time to time, and so it's very important, obviously, that you get it right. So I would absolutely encourage you to seek out a tax professional who can make sure you're doing all of this the right way. I hope this very convoluted and confusing issue is helpful to you. Again, I encourage you to check out the show notes to help sort of lay all this out. I'll have some charts and things laid out there that I think will make it a little bit easier. Okay, now on to a topic that's not nearly as difficult to talk about, and that's our tip of the day. And I found this one. This is actually a tool I've not used before, but I hope I will. I've got to go back into my records to see what I can find. You'll understand what I mean in a minute. It's called GetAirHelp, GetAirHelp, GetAirHelp.com. And when you go to the site, it says, get your money back. If you've been on a delayed or canceled flight or been denied boarding within the last 3 years, you could be entitled to up to $800 from the airline. I found this tool. It was actually referenced in an article on CNN. It was a site that I'd never heard of before. And so I started to think, well, wait a minute. I know I've been bumped from flights and delayed, and I just don't know. I'd have to go back and try to figure out the flight numbers and the dates and all of that. I'm going to do it and give this site a try, but I haven't gotten to it yet. And I thought, well, there's no reason keeping it to myself. Why not mention it to you all? Maybe some of you have already used it. And if you have, I'd love to hear how it went for you and what you think of it. If it was helpful. Did you get anything back? How did it work? And if you're going to use it, I'd love to hear your experience then. If you're going to try it sometime, going forward here, would love to hear how it worked for you. When I can find the time, I'm going to go back. Probably in my email, I'll see. I know even this year I've had some flight issues with cancellations. I just need to go back and figure out. I can't even remember which airlines they were on, let alone the date and the flight number. But I know it's in my email somewhere. So I'm going to do some email searches and see what I can find and give this tool a try. But I wanted to mention it to you now. Again, it's GetAirHelp.com. Well, there you go. Hey, hope you have a great day. I hope today's podcast did not give you a migraine headache. If it didn't, I will consider my job done. Complicated stuff, I know, but it is important. Again, any questions, shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net. You can find the show notes at DoughRoller.net/podcast109. Until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.